They said women were irrational. They said women were unstable. They said women were dangerous, not to society, but to themselves. The real danger was never the women, though. It was the diagnosis. A diagnosis with no symptoms, no lab values, no biological markers. It was a diagnosis created not from science, but from discomfort, from confusion, from fear, and from control. For almost 2,000 years, hysteria was used like a net, a very wide net cast over women who were grieving, women who were angry, maybe they were exhausted, maybe they were in pain, women who were in love, and women who were in danger, or even women who were just trying to exist. Think about that. A woman could lose a child and be called hysterical. A woman could be abused and be called hysterical. A woman could disagree with her husband, which we do on a daily basis, and be called hysterical. Or maybe she was just intelligent, ambitious, or God forbid, outspoken, and be called hysterical. Hysterical was not just a diagnosis, it was a muzzle. And today, on Twisted History Tuesday, inside the dark history of women's health, we're unraveling how a single word became a weapon used by the medical system to silence, control, and pathologize women for millennia. And the most twisted part, the echoes of it are still in the exam rooms today. I'm Dr. Nickeya Laycock, nurse practitioner, and let me tell you something. The more you learn about the history of women's health, the more you realize just how deep the roots of medical dismissal really go. We like to think that our modern system is advanced, enlightened, and sophisticated, but the truth is, a system that spent nearly 2,000 years medicalizing women's emotions doesn't shake it off overnight. This episode is not just history, it's context. It's the reason your symptoms were dismissed the last time you went to your doctor's office. It's the reason that your grandmother suffered in silence. And it's the reason that so many women never received the care that they deserved. Let's start with where this story truly begins. Not with medicine, but with mythology. In ancient Egypt, around 1900 BCE, healers wrote on those papyrus scrolls about a mysterious condition that was affecting their women. They believed that the uterus wasn't anchored the way that the other organs were. Instead, it drifted around and floated and wandered through the body. To them, the uterus was almost alive, if you will, a creature that had moods and desires and instincts. One ancient text actually described it as a living animal within an animal. If a woman felt short of breath, they said the uterus had floated upward and was like pressing on the heart. If she felt numbness or pain, the uterus had slid towards the limbs. If she felt sad, the uterus had sunk. And if she felt desire, the uterus was hungry. That word, hungry, appears repeatedly. The uterus was portrayed as a demanding organ that needed sexual activity, pregnancy, or constant attention to stay calm. So, what did the treatment look like? It was not medication, not herbs, not rest. Instead, the healers would place sweet-smelling oils on the woman's nose and foul-smelling substances near her vagina. The idea was to lure, I can't say this without laughing, it was to lure the uterus back into place with fragrance or repel it with stink. That's right. Your emotional problems were blamed on a uterus wandering around like a lost dog, and the solution was aromatherapy. But this wasn't a fringe theory. It became the foundation for centuries of medical thinking. Medicine just didn't misunderstand women. It misunderstood women because it misunderstood the uterus. By the time we reach ancient Greece, hysteria has shape shifted some. The uterus is no longer portrayed as this free floating beast, but it's still blamed for just about everything. Hippocrates, the man medical students learn about today, believed emotional instability in women stemmed from a womb deprived of sexual release in childbirth. To him, celibacy was dangerous, childlessness was harmful, widowhood was psychologically destabilizing. Menstruation was a cleansing process, and female desire, a sign that the uterus was restless. Picture a young woman grieving the loss of her husband, and instead of comfort, she's told that her womb is drying out and causing mental illness. This was not a metaphor, this was medical doctrine. And from that belief system came a chilling, long-lasting prescription. If a woman was distressed, the solution was marriage. If she felt overwhelmed, the cure was pregnancy. If she seemed depressed, the treatment was more pregnancy. The idea that women's emotions came from reproductive malfunction became the cornerstone of Western medicine. And with each century, diagnosis grew roots, deep ones. The Romans inherited the Greek medical theories and added their own twist to it. They believed that women were physically softer, mentally weaker, and emotionally more fragile. Not by accident, but by design. Writers like Galen claimed that women were essentially inverted men, colder, wetter, and less rational. Their bodies were governed by fluids and humors that made them unpredictable. And when a woman reacted to stress, trauma, or oppression, it was not her environment, it was her nature. Imagine that. A woman grieving a lost child, nature. A woman is terrified of her abusive husband, nature. A woman collapses from anemia due to an iron deficiency. It's her nature. Everything was her nature. Nothing was circumstance. And here's the kicker. A woman's testimony about her own symptoms had no weight. None. Her interpretation was considered unreliable because in the Roman eyes, she was inherently irrational. If you're irrational, your reasoning doesn't make sense, right? So if a woman said, "I'm terrified," she was dismissed. If she said, "I'm in pain," she was doubted. And if she said, "I'm hurting," she was silenced. And that pattern in validating women's voices will follow us all the way to today, to modern medicine. As Christianity spread through Europe, hysteria took on a new shape. Later on, now women's emotions weren't just biological, they were spiritual. A woman crying uncontrollably was no longer seen as struggling, she was tempted. A woman who withdrew or went numb after trauma wasn't traumatized, she was judged. A woman with panic attacks wasn't overwhelmed, she was weak in spirit. Medicine and religion at this point blurred. Grief became sin, desire became shame, anger became rebellion, and women paid the price. Many women showing symptoms of what we now know as postpartum depression were isolated and punished. Women experiencing PMS or like perimenopausal symptoms might be accused of being touched by evil forces. Not a joke. And women who dared to challenge any kind of male authority, they weren't seen as symptomatic. They were seen as dangerous. Thousands of women, especially midwives, widows, and healers, definitely outspoken women, were accused of witchcraft or heresy. When you read the accusations closely, many of them start with emotional behavior, sadness, anger, sexual autonomy, boundary setting. The emotional lives of women became grounds for punishment. And hysteria, though not always named, became the justification. When Europe entered the Renaissance, medicine tried to reclaim the authority over the female body. Doctors criticized religious explanations, but held tightly to the belief that women were inherently unstable. Still that common theme there. They published elaborate manuals describing the hysterical woman, and the descriptions were astonishing in their breadth. A woman who talked too much was hysterical. A woman who barely spoke was hysterical. She laughed loud, hysterical, cried, ambitious, resisted marriage. All of this was hysteria. The entire range of the female emotion from joy to grief became pathological. And the treatments reflected that belief. The women were given ice baths to shock the mind. Hot irons were placed on the abdomen to calm the womb. There was purges, bleeding, blistering, electric shocks, forced feedings, isolation. None of this treated the root causes of the women's symptoms because the system didn't believe that women had root causes. When you start to view women's emotions as an illness, then you no longer feel obligated to listen to what's going on. When the Victorian era arrived, hysteria didn't just survive, it exploded. This period from the early 1800s through the turn of the century was fascinated with emotions. Not in a compassionate way, but in a voyeuristic, controlling, and almost obsessive way. Victorian culture demanded a certain kind of woman, delicate, modest, sexually restrained, obedient, quiet, and morally pure. And that standard was essentially impossible to meet because women are human. Humans laugh loudly, they get angry, grieve, they want things, resist things, and they have needs. But the Victorian woman, she had to be a statue, essentially. And if she wasn't, medicine had a name for that. Can you guess what it was? Yes, hysteria. Hysteria became a fashionable diagnosis. Doctors believed that the upper class women were especially prone to this because Victorian society believed that too much education, too much independence, too many passions or ambitions could actually overwhelm a woman's delicate nervous system. Think about that. A woman asked for more intellectual stimulation. She got a diagnosis. She wants to express her frustration from the constant social pressure. She got a diagnosis. A woman reaches for her limit of her emotional labor. Diagnosis. Hysteria became the medical explanation for women living inside an impossible cage. The Victorian medical journals described hundreds of potential signs of hysteria. Some women fainted, not because of hysteria, but because their corsets restricted their lungs and crushed their ribs. Yes. Some trembled, not because they were unstable, but because they were malnourished or on restrictive diets to maintain femininity. My mom can't say aluminum. I can't say femininity. Some ladies cried, not because of emotional fragility, but because they had no autonomy. And here's the heartbreaking part. Many women internalized it. They genuinely believed something was wrong with them. One British woman wrote in her diary, "When I speak of my needs, I am told I am ill. When I am silent, I am praised. Is my silence health?" That question echoes through time. In truth, many women diagnosed with hysteria were likely experiencing severe anxiety, postpartum depression, undiagnosed thyroid conditions that we now know are common, anemia, trauma, abusive marriage, sexual repression, grief, or the sheer suffocation of their societal limitations. The medicine doesn't look at circumstance, it looked at the woman and it blamed her body. And now for the treatments. And this is the part that people tend to argue about. Some treatments for hysteria were bizarre, some were horrifying, and some, though sensationalized online, were actually misunderstood. Let's talk about one of the most infamous ones. The idea that the Victorian doctors regularly performed genital massage to induce a paroxysm, aka orgasm. Did the pelvic treatments exist? Yes. Did some physicians use manual therapy for what they called this pelvic congestion? Yes. Did early vibrators emerge in medical settings? Also, yes. But was this the routine everyday practice that TikTok imagines? No. There's no historical evidence that doctors lined up women and manually stimulated them en masse. There's no proof that it was the default treatment, and no proof that it was considered sexual by the physicians themselves. They saw it as a mechanical treatment. What is true is actually more disturbing than all of that. Victorian physicians were so uncomfortable acknowledging any kind of female sexuality that even when stimulation happened, they refused to recognize that there was pleasure happening. They described an orgasm like responses in cold clinical language, muscular release, nervous discharge, paroxysm, as if the body was malfunctioning rather than responding. And that is a real horror. Not the treatments themselves, but the erasure of women's sexual experience altogether. Women's desire was as medicalized as sickness. Women's pleasure was stripped of meaning. The women's bodies were treated as objects to correct, not beings with agency. And now for one of the most widespread and destructive treatments was something that they called the rest cure. Sounds gentle, but it wasn't. Developed by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell in the late 1800s, the rest cure involved weeks to months of isolation. No reading, no writing, no intellectual stimulation whatsoever, no physical activity, no heavy feeding, constant bed rest, and absolute obedience. It was used primarily on upper class women, especially those who showed any kind of ambition, any woman who expressed frustration, wanted education, or anybody who pushed back. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was an American writer. She was subjected to this treatment. She later wrote that in her famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, based on her experience, a chilling tale of a woman who loses her sanity under forced confinement. Women placed on the rest cure often deteriorated rapidly. Without stimulation, their minds sort of spiraled. Without autonomy, their spirits broke. And without any kind of movement, their bodies just weakened. We know this. Especially, anybody that's in healthcare. First thing you do for somebody that's in the hospital is you get them up and you get them moving because people get weak fast. So same situation here. Doctors at that time, unfortunately, interpreted the decline as the proof of their illness, not the consequences of their own treatment. Imagine being depressed, anxious, traumatized, or even postpartum and having your treatment be total isolation. Of course, that's not going to help. Women didn't heal. They just sort of disappeared. Hysteria was one of the easiest labels to weaponize. A woman who wanted to silence a husband who wanted to silence his wife could declare her hysterical. Father, maybe who disapproved of his daughter's choices, could claim that she was overtaken by this female madness. And doctors trusted men accounts over women's words every time. Women were institutionalized indefinitely. There was no trial, no appeal, no voice. It's not like today. And inside these asylums, treatments ranged from the ineffective to the downright cruel. So like the ice baths that we mentioned, meant to shock the nerves, isolation without windows, electric currents applied to the spine. They did forced feedings, restraint chairs, enemas, purges, just torture. And then, of course, in some cases, they actually did experimental surgeries meant to cure the female emotional instability. If a woman spoke out against her confinement, doctors also saw it as further proof of her quote unquote illness. Defiance was not a cry for help, it was a symptom. One woman institutionalized in the 1880s wrote, "I screamed that I was not mad. They wrote in my chart, compulsive shouting." How do you escape this diagnosis designed to invalidate your every protest? You don't. And that was the point. Hysteria was never about medicine, it was about obedience. And women who didn't comply or simply couldn't paid the price. But the story doesn't end there because hysteria didn't just vanish, it evolved. In this next little section, we're diving into the 20th century, how hysteria made its way into modern psychiatric manuals, how it was finally removed, and why its shadow still follows every woman who walks into a doctor's office today. As we step into the 20th century, you would think that this hysteria diagnosis would fade away. And modern science would finally give women a fair assessment, but instead, hysteria didn't die, transformed. Victorian corsets loosened, but the medical assumptions tightened. The language softened, but the disbelief sharpened, and the blame stayed exactly the same. Doctors no longer blamed the wandering womb, but they still believed that women's emotions were suspect. Physical became psychological, the uterus was replaced by the mind, and that change was even more dangerous. In the early 1900s, hysteria found its new champion, Sigmund Freud. For Freud, hysteria wasn't a physical problem, it was a psychological one, and at the center of it was sexuality and trauma. He believed that many female patients were expressing repressed memories of childhood abuse or sexual assault. And at first, Freud actually suggested that these women were telling the truth. And then he backpedaled and withdrew that claim. He later declared that women's accounts were fantasies, not memories, not trauma, not real, just delusions born out of the demented female mind. He replaced, "Why did this happen to you?" with, "Why are you imagining this?" That reversal really changed everything. Women who came forward with sexual trauma were labeled imaginative, unstable, hysterical. Their stories were dismissed as psychological invention. And the message was clear. A woman's truth was unreliable, her body was unreliable, and so were her emotions. One of the most famous cases of the era was a young lady known as Anna O. She experienced paralysis, hallucinations, anxiety, and severe distress, likely linked to trauma, grief, and chronic illness. But Freud's interpretation, under Freud's interpretation, Anna became the poster child for hysteria, a symbol of how the female mind supposedly invents suffering. This is still going on today. But what he ignored, Anna had developed tuberculosis, a real physical illness which caused many of her symptoms. But the diagnosis of hysterical imagination is what stuck. Her story just shows how easily some women's symptoms were shown as emotional, even when their bodies were begging to be heard. Throughout the 20th century, women flooded hospitals with symptoms that we now understand: migraines, seizures, autoimmune disease, thyroid disorders, endometriosis, PCOS, severe PMS, and postpartum depression. But instead of anybody actually investigating these, they were reassured. They were dismissed, labeled nervous, anxious, fragile, and yes, hysterical. Women reporting abdominal pain from undiagnosed endometriosis were told it was just stress. Women with autoimmune disorders were told it was anxiety. And women with cardiac symptoms were told that it was all in their head. They were just imagining it. Women with PMDD were told that they were just dramatic. And the more women insisted that something was actually wrong, the more certain the doctors became that they were just hysterical. A self-fulfilling diagnosis, a trap. In 1952, when the American Psychiatric Association created the first diagnostic of statistical manual of mental disorders, the DSM, hysteria was included. That was in 1952. Think about that. While men were being diagnosed with depression and anxiety or physiological conditions, women were still being diagnosed with hysteria. It lingered in the DSM for decades. It was renamed, repackaged, redefined, but the core idea remained: women's emotional reactions were pathological. It wasn't until 1980 that the hysteria was officially removed. So just 2 years before I was born, hysteria was finally removed from the DSM. That means your mother, your grandmother, and maybe even you lived in a world where hysteria still existed, not just in culture, but the actual medical rule book. Yes, it still affects us all. And even though the diagnosis is gone, hysteria's ghost is everywhere. Even when a woman comes into the ER with chest pain, she's more likely to be told that it's anxiety. When when a woman describes complex symptoms, she's more likely to be given an SSRI for depression than an actual full workup. When a woman insists something feels wrong, she's labeled dramatic, sensitive, and hormonal. I've seen it firsthand, and I've been treated that way firsthand. You hear it in phrases like, "It's probably just stress." "Maybe you're overreacting." These symptoms are pretty common for women. It's just your age. Let's just monitor it. Sounds like anxiety. Your labs are normal, so you're actually fine. And what's sad is I'm probably guilty of saying these things to women also, because that's what I was taught. It wasn't until I was actually put in the shoes of a woman needing healthcare in America that I realized how broken the system is. Modern medicine has replaced the wandering womb with a wandering mind, but the impact is still the same. Women are still fighting to be believed. The hysteria mindset lingers in gap years in autoimmune diagnosis, the neglect of chronic pelvic pain, the dismissal of perimenopause, the normalization of unbearable period pain, and the minimization of hormonal symptoms. And it shows up most clearly in that devastating modern phrase that everything looks fine, even when everything feels wrong. Women have learned because of this to doubt themselves. They learn to apologize for being in pain. They learn to explain their symptoms in soft voices with careful smiles. They learn to shrink their concerns so they don't sound dramatic. And when the doctors don't listen, women start to question their own instincts. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe it really is nothing. Maybe I'm just being a woman. That's the legacy of hysteria. Not the old textbooks, not the outdated theories, the conditioning, the way women are taught implicitly that their bodies are unreliable narrators. Hysteria was never about illness, it was about control. It controlled women's bodies, it controlled women's narratives and women's choices. Across thousands of years, hysteria served one purpose: to make women doubt themselves while granting others the authority to define them. But here's the truth you deserve to hear. Your emotions are not symptoms. Your boundaries are not instability. Your pain is not an exaggeration. Your intuition is not hysteria. Your body is speaking, and it deserves to be heard. This is why I do this work. This is why Body Bloom Health and Wellness even exists, because women deserve providers who listen, providers who validate, providers who understand that your symptoms are not a nuisance. They're actually a message your body is speaking and telling you what's going on. There's a saying that there's always smoke before there's fire, and that is true. And we are able to detect that smoke if you listen to your body. And somebody listens to you expressing this before it becomes a major issue. But that's the legacy that we're trying to rewrite. One woman at a time, one story at a time, one Tuesday at a time. Thank you for joining me today on this Twisted History Tuesday inside of the Dark History of Women's Health Body Bloom podcast. Next week, we're going to talk about the dark origins of birth control, the trials that they never taught you about. And trust me, this one's even darker. If any of this resonated with you, or you think that it may resonate with another lady friend of yours, please share, like, subscribe, get the word out there. I'm trying to make a difference in the world of healthcare for women. That is my goal. That is what I'm aiming to do. So I can't do it alone, though. I need your help. So if you share this with everybody, I would greatly appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll see you in a couple of days for our regularly scheduled programming. Have a great day.